All right, we've been talking about the evidences for macroevolution. We've identified 3 general fields of study that lend evidence for macroevolution so far. We've talked about comparative anatomy. We've talked about the fossil record and biochemistry, how studying those scientific areas give some evidence for evolution, macroevolution. Now we're going to talk a little bit about biogeography. It's our 4th and last category of evidences for macroevolution, biogeography. And we're going to begin this by talking about the broad geologic separations and continental drift events that have occurred that help us to see some evidence for macroevolution out there. First of all, most of us are aware of the idea of continental drift these days, how the continents are not stuck in position but are gradually moving in relation to one another, and we understand that's how regions of seafloor spreading account for some of the formation of the Earth's crust, how the molten rock comes up in the middle of the seafloor and causes separation of the continental land masses, or continental plates, I should say. And then there are places where 2 continental land masses are being pushed together, and one of them tends to be pushed down under the other, forming mountain ranges and volcanoes and that sort of thing. So there are different kinds of events pushing the continents around, and a lot of places they move just an inch or so a year in relation to one another. But anyway, these continental movements, continental land masses that move, or plates that move, account for, if we can follow it back in time, accounts for the existence of a general landmass we call Pangaea that supposedly existed 230 million years ago or more. Some say 220, but it began, the movement of land masses supposedly put Pangaea together about 280, 290 or more million years ago. But anyway, so all of the Earth's surface was not divided into separate land masses at that time. It was all kind of joined together in one group of continental plates to form Pangaea at that time. So if you could look at the Earth at that time, you would see parts of it all joined together here and all down through. So then, wherever we are in North America right now, if I put next right there where we are, then there would be no sea separating you from parts of Siberia or parts of India or Antarctica. So it'd be all kind of connected in there. If that would be the case, then the different animals that lived on land at that time, and plants that may disperse later, they could go to any particular location. So we don't have any barriers to dispersal of the different organisms that lived on land at that time, or that lived in fresh water on the continents at that time. So anyway, that was like 230 million years ago. Then following us more movement of the continents, we get a separation of the northern continents from the southern continents, and there develops a gap in here between the two. And that allows for the formation of Laurasia and Gondwana. So we've gone from one continent, the Pangaea continent, to the northern Laurasia and the southern Gondwana. This is often referred to as Gondwana land down here below. So anyway, that event between 220 and 160 million years ago, we see this overall separation. Now there's a whole lot of other movement of the tectonic plates, tectonic movements going on here that fragment some of these sections so that they are underwater for a time and then they're above the surface for a while. Much of Europe was quite disturbed and separated from Asia at different times here, but anyway, this is the general idea. Most of the separation was just between these two general regions during that period of geologic time. Now, there are some organisms that we think of still today as being primarily Laurasian. Apparently, their ancestral lineage was here and was not able to get across the oceans to get into Gondwana, and vice versa. There are certain lineages that are thought to be primarily Gondwanan that were prevented from colonizing in Laurasia during the time. They would spread through Gondwana, but not across to Laurasia. Some of the things we think of, salamanders are Laurasian. We find them in Asia, Europe, North America, but historically they were not in the southern continents. Many of our groups of frogs were primarily Gondwanan in origin and had not spread into the Laurasian continent at that time. Same would be true for some mammal groups and plant groups and so on, that there was a particular fauna, flora and fauna that would be considered Gondwanan, and there was a separate flora and fauna that would be thought of as Laurasian. And we can see that isolation of those groups and speciation and so on, spreading of single taxa within this space, but not down here and vice versa. So we have things that are considered Laurasian and things that are considered Gondwanan in their origins. Now that separation was not completely permanent, but anyway, we see more fragmentation of those land masses in years that follow, so that now we have from Laurasia, we have North America, and both Europe and Asia are tied together. There we refer to that as Eurasia. North America and Eurasia come from the Laurasian continent. A little note here, just going to put here, not India. India came from the Gondwanan continent. So from Gondwana we have South America, Africa, Australia, Antarctica, and India. These major continental land masses, these are all continents today, with the exception of India. These are all separate. India has moved to run into the Asian continent. That's where we have the buildup of the Himalayan mountain range, where we have that pushing together of the Indian subcontinent and the Eurasian continent there. Now those taxa that have come up even more recently may be even isolated to, say, Africa or Australia. A lot of things isolated, of course, into Australia has a more well-known and identified unique fauna there with all of its marsupial mammals especially. Let's see, interestingly, ostriches are thought to have, some of the ostriches in the fossil record found in Asia were thought to have come by way of India, so that as India moved into the Asian continent, some of the ostriches that were present in Gondwana moved with that Indian continent to spread into Asia. There's an idea that's out there. Let's see. Some frogs also came across supposedly with India to spread into the Asian region, probably, and a lot of other things we could think of that were spread that way as India met with Asia. And there are other places where now there's contact between South America and North America, of course, across the Panamanian land bridge. So those two continents eventually formed a connection, supposedly through geologic time. So the South American fauna was able to move north, and North American fauna was able to move south across that connection through Central America. We think of things like the possum, the North American opossum, that has supposedly come up across that Panamanian land bridge. So now we have that one species of marsupial in the northern continents. And same is true with the armadillo. There's several armadillo species in South America, but there's one that spread into North America, and it seems to be continuing to spread, and only recently found in our region from that South America. So now it's in North America. So anyway, there are a lot of examples. You can try to follow their path through time as they go from continent to continent as land bridges form. There have been land bridges formed between Asia, the European side, and North America, near Canada in the north there. The connections there over time. None right now. Also between Alaska and Siberia, a connection across there we call the Beringia land bridge. The Bering Strait is what it's known as now. So they're not connected by land at this point, but at times in the past they were thought to be connected in such a way that plants and animals might move from Siberia to Alaska or Alaska to Siberia in that region. Also, there's a connection between Africa and Europe now, or the southern Mideast there. So we see a new connection between Africa and those other regions. But anyway, this accounts for some of what we know about the distribution of organisms, and you can kind of tie it to the phylogenetic history of those organisms, different families and genera and so forth that have either been isolated to a particular landmass, or you can see how they spread from that location into other locations on the Earth's surface. Our next topic, dealing with biogeography, we're going to identify as radiation of taxa. Radiation of taxa. This just means that they start in one place and then radiate out to other locations. As new species develop, they radiate out into adjacent regions to their point of origin. That point of origin is referred to often as an endemic center. If something is endemic to a region, that means it's its place of origin. We can often refer to endemic populations of people in different places on the Earth's surface, like the Inuit in the northern climates of Alaska and Siberia and so forth. But anyway, so in this statement here, regions of endemism, places where things originate, show a greater variety of taxon subgroups because of repeated speciation events, or by way of repeated speciation events. So basically what we're saying here, if we have a point of origin for a taxon, say this is a particular location where this group is represented initially by just a single species. And then over time, that species is able to spread out to other areas, and in some of the other areas where it is allowed to spread, it sets up a new species. We have one of those allopatric speciation events where the new population that becomes established becomes different over time and is no longer reproductively compatible with the original species there. So we have speciation events. So we're going to have one speciation event, maybe another one over into here, and then that one might spread and you'll get another speciation event here, and eventually you get more species to develop, and then they can spread back and overlap with the original population, so that over time you get this pattern where there are more different species in close to that center of origin, that endemic center, and as you spread out away from that, you have fewer represented subgroups or species or subtaxa from that original point of origin, from that endemic center. So regions of endemism may show a greater variety of taxon subgroups in the center. And corollary would be that areas farther from the center Areas farther from the endemic center have fewer subgroups. Of the taxon. So we see this pattern, this radiation. You start in one place and you have them speciate out around that, and then they start to, all these different taxa tend to expand their distributions, and as they do so, you have a high number of different taxa from that original lineage in the center of that distributional pattern, and then fewer as you go out from that. It's something we can see in a lot of different groups. And we'll illustrate now with salamanders. They're in the eastern United States. We have the highest diversity of salamander groups. So especially in the southern Appalachians. The Smoky Mountains of Tennessee and North Carolina, they claim to be the salamander capital of the world because of the high diversity of salamander taxa and species in that region. So that's, in fact, the most concentrated region of salamander taxa. So if we take some that are more or less restricted to that, there's a genus called Laurognathus that is found just in a small area of the Appalachians. Some other species that are more limited to the general region here might include the, let's see, Aeneas, the green salamander found through this area. The Desmognathus salamanders would be found over a broader area from down in Florida and across to Louisiana, and then up into the New England states and down. And then there's another group, the let's say the Gyronophilus. The Gyronophilus also found generally through this area here. Pseudotriton. Let's see, it expands even out into the coastal areas here. There's a couple of others that occur that are spread out into the coastal plain there. But anyway, there are a number of different taxa that seem to have their greatest number of species here in this Appalachian region between New York and Georgia, spread across there. And as you get further away from that center, you get fewer and fewer represented genera and fewer species of the family. Plethodontidae is the family represented here by all these. So anyway, there's an expansion as you go from the center outward. You see the same sort of thing with other kinds of taxa. I'm thinking of like a number of ground squirrel species out in the western states, in Nevada and Utah and so forth. We have chipmunks here, is all we have here. Rattlesnakes, there's a lot of different rattlesnakes out in the western states. Probably a dozen different species of rattlesnakes out there. We have 2 in the east, really. So anyway, well, 3 or 4. But anyway, you see that center of endemism, a point of where there's a likely start to the spread of the taxa, and then you have speciation events allow for expansion of that into neighboring regions. So you have fewer species represented at the margins and more species in that center. So the radiation of taxa, and evidence from the field of biogeography for long-term evolutionary events, macroevolution. Now for our third concept under biogeography, how biogeography can lend support for the idea of macroevolution. We're going to talk about islands and refugia. Islands and refugia, we've kind of touched on this with the speciation concept before, allopatric speciation. But here we're talking about fragmented populations that are located either in refugia, that means isolated locations of suitable habitat, or on islands, and of course those would be isolated locations of suitable habitat separated by oceans or water. So anyway, a refugium is kind of like an island to itself. Maybe it's a water hole in the desert or a mountaintop environment that is unique and only found on mountaintops. That would make it a refugium. But anyway, fragmented populations located on refugia or on islands speciate. That means they become different over time and form recognizable subgroups. That's pretty self-explanatory. We want to use a couple of examples, and I'm going to try to draw out these two examples in a little more detail than I had with the salamander example we had a minute ago. That salamander example is on our website, so you can see a little better map presentation of how radiation of taxa would occur there. But anyway, we'll try to do a little better job on the board here next, showing desert pupfish and some of the sawback map turtles here. All right, this is with respect to a particular species, well, a group of species of what we call desert pupfish. Pupfish, they're small fish, kind of drab in most of their features. They're not particularly unique. A little heavier body than a guppy would be, or a minnow. But anyway, these are referred to as pupfish, desert pupfish. This is California, this is Nevada, right here. So along the border, somewhere in here is Death Valley. Along through here, we'd say this is Death Valley. So it's in that general area of Death Valley that we see these different species of pupfish. And we think that would be an unlikely place to see a whole bunch of different species of fish in Death Valley. Well, there are springs here. It's thought that at one time there used to be more water in this region, and there would be streams that would flow down through here that would originally have just a single species of pupfish. When they get started, there are actually more species related to this down into Mexico. But anyway, in this region right here, supposedly there were streams that were all connected here, and over time, as it changed over to deserts, some of those streams went under the ground, into the sand, so they're part of the aquifer system there. But in places there are still areas with water on the surface. And these desert springs that we have, where there's still water available on the surface, are now isolated from one another in such a way that we have separated populations of pupfish in these different springs in the desert. So let's identify some of these different pupfish species that are around that particular location. So now I've put names on all these populations of the pupfish that we have in here. The best known probably is the devil's hole pupfish. It's been on the endangered species list for a while, and it is found in kind of a rocky opening surrounded by a rock formation, this hole down in there that has just a pool of water connected to, of course, all the groundwater that's in there. But anyway, devil's hole pupfish there. And then adjacent to that here on the Nevada side, we have the Warm Springs pupfish and Ash Meadows pupfish. So those three found in that area. I'm not sure exactly the degree of isolation, if they're all, you know, just in a hole like the devil's hole pupfish is, or how what their environment looks like. But they are isolated, maybe in 1, 2, or 3 different springs or waterways in that location. And then down here on the California side, the Shoshone and Tecopa pupfishes, the Amargosa River pupfish, Saratoga Springs pupfish. And then back up on the north end of Death Valley over here, we have Owens pupfish and Salt Creek pupfish and Cottontail Marsh pupfish. I know the Cottontail Marsh is more of a flat area where there's more of a surface area of water spread out for that particular species to live in. I'm not sure about the other habitats so much, but anyway, they are separated and they've been isolated for a number of years. Some say only about 10,000 years, but anyway, each population is identifiable. They have different features, they look different from one another. Whether or not they would be able to interbreed with one another is a question that really hasn't been addressed very well to my knowledge anyhow. Will they, if they're put together with one another, will they interbreed? If they do, is that significant to us? Would we want to lump the species? We'd no longer maybe have the devil's hole pupfish as an endangered species if it was lumped together with all these others. But it's not uncommon to see two different well-separated species, if you put them back together, that they would produce offspring and produce hybrids of their different species in the laboratory. But anyway, this is an example of what was supposedly, what we would think maybe at one time was just one species, and over time it has been divided into these different populations, and those populations have developed different traits, subtle different features, coloration, fin shape, body size, and so forth, that is different between the different populations. So anyway, that's the pupfish example. Now another example. All right, here I have another map for another example of how we can see geographic separation of taxa into isolated locations, this idea of refugia or islands of suitable habitat. On my map here, we have Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, across the Gulf Coast here. There are 3 river systems on my map, the first one over here being the Pearl River, next to that the Pascagoula River, and then the Mobile River down here leading into Mobile Bay, and then a couple of tributaries to that, just the Alabama and the Tennessee River up above here. So all of those draining into the Gulf of Mexico. There are some turtles that are found only in these particular river drainages. So in this first river drainage over here, the Pearl River drainage, we have the ringed sawback. Turtles called sawbacks are called sawbacks because the scales down the middle of the shell kind of make a jagged edge from one scale to the next, so it looks like it's toothed along the back, so they call it the sawback turtle. This one has rings in each of the scales on its shell on the back, so that each scale on the shell has a nice circle, a yellowish circle or orangey circle in each scale. So anyway, the ringed sawback is found here. It's close species, closely related species. Next door is the yellow blotched sawback, found in these drainages along the Pascagoula River. So it's called the blotched. Should call it the yellow blotched, excuse me. Yellow blotched sawback turtle, there in the Pascagoula River system. So this one, instead of having yellowish rings or orangish rings on each of the scales, has a yellow blotch in the middle of each of the scales on the shell on the back. So the yellow blotched sawback. In the next river system over, draining into the Mobile Bay down there in this river system, we have what's called the black-knobbed sawback. Black-knobbed sawback. So along its mid-dorsal ridge on the shell. Instead of having just a sharp sawtooth kind of edge on its scales, it has more of a knobby process up there. They are not yellow blotched, they are not ringed. So anyway, it's a different looking turtle than the others. But they are all very similar to one another in most respects, thought to be derived from a common ancestry. But now they are no longer come in contact with one another. They are river turtles. They stay close to their main river in each case, so you don't see mixing between one river system and the next. And down here at the Gulf, there's salt water across here separating the different populations from one another so that they wouldn't travel from one river system to the next down here. So these are isolated, thought to be derived from what was one species at one time that ranged through this whole area, but are now well separated into 3 different species. Another example of where we see this island or refugium kind of idea. These are refugia, suitable habitats that are separated from one another, and where we see some evidence of speciation going on there, so that they look very distinctly different from one another, these 3 species of turtle. So that's the end of the third area of evidences for macroevolution. What we see is biogeography. Biogeography. There are a lot of other examples like the one we see here with this turtle, and we saw it with the puckfish that we could refer to. But anyway, we see that pattern over and over again in nature, where we see isolation of species in close proximity to one another.